So Dr. Andy Wallace is a professor and chair of the philosophy department at Sonoma State University since 1998. After having completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago, Andy is taught at the University of Frankfurt in Frankfurt, Germany, Boston College, and the University of Chicago. Dr. Wallace specializes in moral philosophy and moral psychology. For the last 10 years, he's been teaching and researching the origins and significance of compassion and other related pro-social dispositions. Dr. Wallace created an innovative year-long immersion course on the science and philosophy of compassion at Sonoma State for freshmen who learn how to cultivate their innate compassion response through mindfulness meditation, service in the community, and learning about the biology, psychology, ethics, and spirituality of compassion. Dr. Wallace is finishing a manuscript on the science and philosophy of compassion, which he calls the compassion paradox. And I did Andy offered a workshop at hospice that I went to, and for all of us who use compassion all the time, it's like, I realize I don't know much about it. So there is a huge science that he's going to introduce, because he completed in 2017 a 2-year training program at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University Medical School to become certified to teach their compassion cultivation training curriculum. Dr. Wallace teaches compassion cultivation training at Sonoma State in the School of Extended Education, which means that you don't need to be a student. That's for the general public. And Dr. Wallace is currently in training to become certified to teach mindfulness meditation from the Mindfulness Awareness Center at UCLA. So it's wonderful to realize there are all these people at all these prestigious universities studying compassion. And Andy volunteers for St. Joseph's Hospice in the grief support and direct care for dying patients, as well as the No One Dies Alone at Memorial Hospice, a program that provides volunteers to sit vigil with patients who have no family or friends to be with them. And he is drawn to help people who are dying or grieving the loss of loved ones, and he has a passion for working with persons who have intellectual developmental disabilities. He's also willing to be a volunteer for us psychotherapists who are too intellectual sometimes, and help getting into feelings. So after my father died last year, I was really blessed that Andy was my volunteer for 8 sessions and to help me through that process. And so I know firsthand his compassion, and that's why I wanted to invite him here to share him with all of you.
It was really sweet of Jan to offer that introduction for me. Jan actually was my first grief counseling client at St. Joseph's, so I was really lucky to have someone like Jan to work with. And I didn't know anything about this chapter or what you guys do, and she suggested that there might be some interest in learning more about compassion here. So I think when Jan, is it on? Is it on? Yeah. When she told me that, it was the day before the deadline for applying for this thing, and so I said, I don't think I have time to organize it, but I went home and put something together, and I was surprised to get selected. Actually, I was thinking, this isn't going to go, but so really happy to be here. I'm kind of an apostle for the virtues of compassion. I've been studying compassion pretty seriously for around the last 15 years, or 10 to 12, 15 years. I developed this course at Sonoma State for freshmen on compassion based on my research. And then I discovered that the Center for Compassion, Altruism Research and Education at the medical school at Stanford had developed a curriculum for cultivating compassion. I was curious to compare what I had developed with them, and so I took one of their 8-week courses when they first started teaching these courses about 7, 8 years ago at Berkeley, and it just blew me away. And I took another course later with another senior teacher there, and then they finally opened up their training program for people who want to teach this curriculum, and I just completed that 2 years ago. And I teach the CCT class for adults community, people in the helping and caring professions. I try to do one every semester if I can. If I can get the enrollment in to teach it, I teach it at the School of Extended Ed, and I'll talk more about that when I'm done. Before I start, I just want to kind of get a feel for the room here. How many of you think that you're suffering from compassion fatigue right now? Just raise your hand. How many of you think that you have suffered from compassion fatigue in the past? Wow, okay. So I'm going to try to persuade you that there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. There is such a thing as experiencing acute distress when working with people who have acute distress. But it has been mislabeled, in my opinion, as compassion fatigue. And I'm going to try to convince you today that the most sustainable antidote to compassion fatigue is compassion, and more compassion. And you cannot ever have too much compassion, and you can never care too much. And the term compassion fatigue didn't exist until 1992, when it was coined by a historian who wrote an article about that she noticed the distress among emergency room nurses. And she came up with the concept of compassion fatigue, and it took off like wildfire ever since then. And it's funny how a concept from academia that I think really is kind of sloppy thinking and is not really grounded in reality can just take off in popular culture. Everybody here in this room has heard about compassion fatigue. Everybody probably believes it's a reality and it's something that we have to deal with. And there might be something wrong with compassion that we've got to, maybe step back from. So, and I also have to tell you that, I used to give very, very boring vanilla PowerPoint slides, and I just discovered this ability to add color, and I'm a little slow on the uptake on this, right? So I maybe have gone overboard with this presentation, but you get like my Jackson Pollock influence on these slides, all right? So I just want to start out with the main ideas. I've got 3 handouts in the back, and I guess this one is already gone. I didn't think there were going to be this many people. I made 40 copies, but I have electronic copies of all this stuff, and I'm happy to send you this PowerPoint presentation. So the first big idea is compassion fatigue is a misnomer for chronic empathic distress. I'll explain that in a bit. Empathic distress arises from over-identification with the suffering of others. Over-identification with the suffering of others can produce secondary traumatic stress, which psychologists have mislabeled as compassion fatigue or compassion stress. It's not compassion fatigue, in my opinion. It's not compassion stress. It's empathic stress. And empathy is only one part of compassion. And there are different okay, yes, thank you for raising your hand. Okay, so what do you want to do? Do you want to ask questions as I'm going along, or do you want to wait until I'm done and ask your questions then? I'll leave it up to you. I don't really care. What do you prefer? Wait. I'm going to let you go because you raised your hand before everybody said no. And you're the only one who gets to answer your question now. Okay. Is it okay, my standing right here? Is that working? Okay.
Yeah, that's better. I'm a little confused because my definition of compassion fatigue is people who get callous and sarcastic and judgmental when they're dealing with people in distress. It's a reaction to their distress, but that's what my definition is, and it sounds like you're just addressing fatigue as just the feeling distress. But in my definition, so I'm a little confused, and if you could clarify that.
Yeah, I think I will clarify that as I go through the presentation. It's kind of like all in the slides there, so that's an important question. And I don't mean just fatigue, but that's the concept that people use. Compassion fatigue is the language, right? And then the most sustainable, this is the upshot, a long-term antidote to chronic empathic distress is the cultivation of compassion. Compassion for others, compassion for yourself. And so those are the four main ideas that hopefully I'll explain and persuade you to believe. And this is just, I mean, I did this like cursory search. Is this on? And I mean, there are maybe 1,000 books on compassion fatigue. So I'd say most people believe it exists. Carly Josie, in Coping with Compassion Fatigue in 1992, was the one who coined the concept. She was writing about nurses. And Charles Figley is the leading figure. Compassion Fatigue as Secondary Traumatic Stress, an overview is a little more sophisticated. And then this article, I think you might be interested also, Psychotherapist Chronic Lack of Self-Care from 2002. So these are the symptoms that have been associated with compassion fatigue. Exhaustion, cynicism, which is what you mentioned, a sense of inadequacy, depression, depersonalization, obsessive preoccupation with suffering of those being helped, confusion, helplessness, isolation, nightmares can happen, and frequently you self-medicate with drugs and alcohol or food to cope with intense distress. There's just some quotes. This is a quote from Psychology Today. The more one opens up to pain in others, the more likely to share victims' feelings of heartbreak and deception. And I have problems with that because, I mean, in one hand I agree with that, but on the other hand, I disagree with it because it suggests that opening up to pain is the problem. And the problem is not, in my opinion, opening up to pain. The problem is how we manage when we open up to pain. It's very important to open up to pain and to continue to open up to pain. The pain that exists in your own life, the pain that you see in your clients is very, very important to be open to that. But we have control about how open we can be to that pain and how much of that pain to take in us and internalize. And that's the problem. It's not with opening up to pain per se. Compassion fatigue, this is from Figley. Compassion fatigue is the natural and consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. I disagree with that. It's from a malfunction of our capacities to help leads to these problems, but not from helping or wanting to help. And then this is a recent book that I like a lot of this guy's book, Jamal Zaki's at Stanford, The War for Kindness. And this is just a title from his 5th chapter, Caring Too Much. I just put it out there because, in my opinion, it's never possible to care too much. Never. The caring is never undermining to you, never leads to bad health outcomes. So here are some stats. I tried to get stats from, marriage and family therapists, since that's how everybody here is an MFT, right? Yeah, okay. But I couldn't find any real robust studies, so there's some minor studies. But this is a very robust study from The Making of Compassion, Stress Injury by Russell and Cowan, and they find 40 to 80% prevalence of compassion fatigue across all helping professions, which is a very high level, very serious problem. It's an especially serious problem in hospitals, nurses, emergency room, people who are daily being exposed to profound, dying pain, are the ones most vulnerable to having their empathic mechanisms dysregulated. This is a study of 132 MMTs, and they found a correlation between the caseload and compassion fatigue. In a study of 82 MFTs, they found the connection between compassion fatigue and ethical violations. So I guess if that I was overhearing, you have a presentation coming up in January on ethics. So it's interesting that the more compassion fatigue, or what I call empathic distress, you experience, the more likely it is you will violate some ethical norm. And it's a final study of 233 social workers working with trauma, especially working with trauma, high correlation with secondary traumatic stress. So there is a problem. But is the problem compassion? There is a problem out there. It's a very serious problem, and we really need to do something about it. But is the problem compassion? So let's go look at what compassion is. This is from the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. It's a more scientific-y definition of compassion. Of course, when we experience it, we don't experience it in these 4 discrete stages. It all happens at once, automatically, very fast. But if you break it down, you can break it down into a perception of suffering, or at least a belief that they're suffering. Of course, you could be wrong, but you don't think you're wrong. And then that can trigger an empathic concern for the sufferer. An empathic concern is a technical term in psychology now, which represents one kind of empathy. And there are at least 2 other kinds of empathy. And the kind of empathy that is involved in compassion is empathic concern for the sufferer. In fact, sometimes psychologists just use empathic concern as a synonym for compassion. Compassion is empathic concern. And sometimes also you find in the literature they'll use sympathy as a synonym for empathic concern or for compassion. So empathic concern, compassion, sympathy go together in the literature and are distinguished from empathy per se. That will lead to a motivation to help if there are no forces in your psyche blocking it. And that motivation to help will lead to an intention to relieve the suffering and doing something if you can do something. So the terminus of this psychic process leading to compassion is intention, engagement, moving forward. And that's very important. Each one of these areas that are implicated in the experience of compassion draw upon different neurological systems in the brain. And in the experience of compassion, when you are able to successfully navigate all these stages, you have a very rich integration of a number of different key subsystems in the brain working in compassion. There are 3 modalities of compassion. You can have compassion for another, and in my opinion, this is synchronically and diachronically the primary form of compassion, is compassion for another. I mean, developmentally in the child, and then from an evolutionary point of view. And then you can have compassion for self, self-compassion, the same desire to care with this empathic concern for others. You're suffering. I see that you're suffering. My heart is open to you. What's going on? How can I help? If I can help, I'm present, I'm here. What's happening? You can apply all of those attitudes and skills and resources to yourself, noticing when you are suffering, noticing when you're in pain, and caring for yourself, as if you were someone else caring for yourself. In fact, I think what's interesting about self-compassion, I'm not going to be able to get into it here, is a very complicated relationship that the self takes to itself when it's nurturing itself. But I think in the developmental literature that I understand, we develop our ability to self through relating to our primary caregivers, identifying with them and then distinguishing ourselves from them. So the origins, our ability to recognize ourselves, lies in our connection to others and in receiving a certain kind of love from them. So we draw upon that psychic structure when we take care of ourselves. I think it's also the origins of being able to adopt an impersonal attitude. To be able to say, okay, yeah, we're all human beings in this room, and I can abstract from my relationship to you as a particular concrete person and see you're a human being just like me, just like everybody else. That's a kind of an impersonal attitude that's very important for ethics, and that is in compassion. Compassion has that capacity to expand out. You see that people who cultivate compassion, they tend to want to expand the scope of their concern for compassion to all sentient beings. It may start, within the human community, but it's very easy to extend over to the non-human community and then to nature itself. Because in Buddhism, for instance, compassion is the highest value, especially in Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. It's the highest value, so it's not surprising to me that you find a lot of vegetarians and pacifists in this, people who are influenced by this religious ideology. It's just a natural psychological tendency of compassion to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It starts out really small within the family, and if you cultivate it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger naturally on its own. You find yourself extending compassion more and more and more. You find yourself extending compassion to people that you don't like. You find that you have less people you don't like. All of that happens because it's the dynamic of the psychological mechanism. So those are the three modalities. In our culture, it seems easier for us to have compassion for others than it is to have compassion for ourselves. I've noticed that in the curriculum at Stanford, they start out with cultivating compassion for another before they turn to compassion for self, because they found in their teaching of this curriculum that people had real obstacles starting out with compassion for self. They couldn't even get going with it, and so it was a little easier for them to get going with compassion for another. And that's probably just an artifact of our culture, right? Because in the Eastern cultures, they always start with compassion for self. There's no problem for having compassion for self. The Dalai Lama didn't understand why Americans had such a hard time with compassion for self. He commented on that. I don't get it, because we don't have that in our culture. Right? So, but anyway, and then I just want to say about receiving compassion is a very subtle state, because if somebody is offering you compassion, you could refuse them. You could say, no, because I want to be independent, I'm autonomous, I'm going to do it on my own, and leave me alone, and whatever, right? Thank you, but no. Right? And so you rebuff them, you reject them, they make a bid, you rebuff the bid, right? So that's going to hurt someone who wants to give you compassion, right? If it's a genuine, open-hearted, opening, expression giving, to be rebuffed is painful to a certain extent. So if you allow a person to give you compassion when you're suffering, you are really doing a service to that person. You're benefiting that person, and you are also benefiting yourself. So receiving compassion combines both compassion for self and compassion for other. And it's a very, very sophisticated capacity. And these can fall apart too, by the way. So you could be really strong in compassion for another, or stronger relative compassion for self and receiving compassion. Or you could be really higher on compassion for self and lower on compassion for another. So they can come apart, but they are connected, large family connected. And I think that as you cultivate your compassion for another, it inevitably will increase your compassion for self, just because of the logic of compassion to spread its beneficial effects far and wide. And then that will open up your willingness to be vulnerable and receive assistance from others. Those are the three main modalities of compassion. So from the inside, what does compassion look like? I've been talking about it from the outside objectively. From the inside, I think what's most important in this new science of compassion, what we're trying to isolate, is this sense of warmth and softness around the heart and a sense of tenderness. It doesn't have to be, crazy, super soft, but there's a softening and an opening that's embodied and felt in the heart region in the bodies. Opening up of the chest, a softness so that you can receive the pain, that you can know it and understand it, so you're softening up. You're not armored up front. There's a focused attention, and I'm just talking about compassion for others. I'm not going to talk anymore about self-compassion unless you ask me questions about it. So this is just compassion for others. Focused attention on the person who's suffering. So that's the object of your mind. It's not you. You are, hopefully should be aware of what you're feeling, but the intention is, okay, there's a deal here. There's something going on. I want to find out what's going on. So you're focused, and there is a resoluteness and stability of the will. There is, I use kind of metaphorical language from, this is kind of from Buddhist psychology, holding the suffering without judgment or fear. Someone shares something very painful happened to him or to her, and you're able to witness it, observe it, without judging or being overwhelmed by it. You're there, present, noticing it, mindful of it, holding it. It's the ability to do that. There is always a sense of hope and optimism with compassion. And even if you're working with people who are dying, and I've experienced this myself, there is always a sense of hope and optimism, because the hope and optimism is a natural effect of the biological systems that we are using when we're being compassionate. This is the biology of hope and the biology of courage. And it's an antidote to the biology of fear. And when compassion breaks down, or when the empathic mechanisms of compassion break down, they trigger the biology of fear. That causes the symptoms that have been associated with compassion fatigue, the cynicism, the isolation, the depression. And this is an element of the paradox of compassion, because as you cultivate compassion, you increase your capacity to be with pain and to handle being with pain, and to transform the interaction with pain into hope and optimism. It's in earlier talks and writings, I sometimes refer to compassion as an alchemical force in our psyche, turning suffering into meaning and purpose. It's an intrinsic, incredibly invaluable resource that we have to do that. There's a concept of psychologists have coined altruism born from suffering. And my mother is an example of altruism born from suffering, because she had a son with Angelman syndrome, a very profound brain damage and intellectual developmental disability. And she went into a suicidal depression when she found out that she also had me, and I had 2 other siblings. And she was seriously considering killing herself and killing her handicapped son, as she was that depressed, where the biology of fear had just exploded in her mind, and she felt hopeless, and there was nothing that could be done, and the only thing that could be done to end the misery was to kill herself and kill her son. And I don't know how she pulled out of it, but she pulled out of it. And she pulled out of it by dedicating herself to working with people with Angelman syndrome and intellectual developmental disabilities. And she ended up creating a nonprofit foundation that now has a $10 million budget and services over 500 IDD adults and children in Houston, Texas, and has been recognized nationally and locally for her philanthropic efforts in helping this community. She's 95 years old. And she's as sharp as a tack. And I think it's because of the altruism born from suffering. It's incredibly powerful, dynamic, transformative force. And it enabled her to take that awful pain of discovering that her son will never grow up and will always be dependent, and turn into something incredibly beautiful and create all this value. She created this value. This value was created from compassion. That was the motivation. And it wasn't just compassion for her son. It was compassion for her son and everyone else like her son, and all the parents who were suffering like she had suffered. So, and even today at 95, she will cry about Ricky. The pain is still there. But what has made it possible for her to cope with that pain and not let that pain suffocate her is the altruism or the compassion. That has been the rock that has moved her forward. So I learned from her firsthand, although I didn't quite understand what was going on, the dynamics, the mechanics, until much later. And even in my earlier career in philosophy, I wasn't interested in any of this stuff, so I wasn't thinking about it. And then there is courage and patience. Compassionate people are courageous people. They're strong people and they're patient people. Be patient. Think in your own life, who are you most patient with? Patience, I was just visiting my mom over Thanksgiving. Patience can be, and I noticed with her that she has incredible patience with my brother, with people like my brother, with people working with my brother. It's like enormous patience, never gets irritated, never snaps, never judges. But driving down the road, somebody driving slow, cutting her off, forget about it. She's screaming at the top of her lungs, so pissed off. I said, Mom, it doesn't matter. You know, compartmentalized, right? So we usually feel the most patience for the people that we feel the most love for. And we usually feel the most love for our siblings, you know, people in our family or our romantic partners or whatever, right? And so in those cases, notice that you usually have more patience with that person than you have with other people. But you can extend the patience to anybody you want. It doesn't have to be limited to the people that you feel most strongly attached to. You can cultivate patience. You can cultivate all of these qualities. These qualities are not fixed. They're flexible. They move. They can be nurtured. We should be teaching them. We should be teaching, I think we should be teaching for people who are going into the caring professions. We have to teach them these techniques because we'll prevent compassion fatigue, aka empathic distress. And then there's a very profound sense of humility in compassion. Compassion is distinguished from pity. Pity is a sense of where you do kind of empathize, but you realize, well, that's not me. That's not going to happen to me, you know. Sorry for you. That's a kind of pity which it kind of has a quality of condensation to it or superiority. Compassion is, that is me. That could be me. That will be me. That might be me. And like, I go working with somebody now with Huntington's, and I always remind myself when I go and hang out with them, and then when I leave, I say, that could be me. That could be me. I could be him. Him. I could be there. At some point I will. Maybe. You know, who knows? Right? At some point. Right? So this is a concept called common humanity. The cultivation of compassion naturally generates in our mind the idea of common humanity. We are all the same. The Dalai Lama says we are all the same in the sense we all want to be happy, we all want to avoid pain. Everybody wants that. Right? Common humanity. And common humanity is a way of framing experience that triggers the compassion response. What could block the compassion response is if you, you don't belong to my tribe, all right? You're in another group, all right? Automatically I block my compassion response. Or you offended me, or you hurt my feelings, so I'm going to block my compassion. My compassion is going to be blocked, all right, towards you. Or things like that, they block it, all right? So that's from the inside. This is kind of an ideal type, Max Weber kind of thing where, you know, generally speaking, this is the constellation of qualities that the psychologists who are working on compassion now are interested in. And there seems to be internal attraction between all these different qualities. They kind of tend up all coming together in the experience of compassion. Okay, so Joan Halifax, anybody heard of Joan Halifax's work? Okay, so she's great, she's really great. And she has a concept that I think, in my mind, beautifully and very succinctly captures this quality of compassion that I'm trying to isolate for you in your experience. Soft belly, strong back. The compassion is a very, very powerful perspective. Tremendous amount of power in compassion, coupled with vulnerability and humility. Both of those being held at the same time. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of compassion and explain to you why compassion is intrinsically uplifting and compassion is impossible to cause fatigue. And I'm going to, I should back up and say this is, in my opinion, I've been studying this, this is the most interesting, up-to-date theory about compassion that's out there right now in the literature. So this psychologist, Shelley Taylor at UCLA, has a really powerful and interesting lab where she's a social neurobiologist, and she came up with this theory which she's called tend and befriend, and you probably have heard of this, tend and befriend. And I'm just interested in the neurology of tend and befriend. And this is kind of a technical definition that I don't need to read out loud. It's basically the function of tend and befriend is to reduce fear and increase hope and courage. That's what it's for. And it causes us to want to connect with people. It causes us to monitor when we're disconnected from people, and it causes us to want to reconnect with people. The tend and befriend system. A very, very powerful system, and it's the system that I think is most essential to human flourishing. And so compassion belongs to this system. Love belongs to this system. Kindness, loving kindness belongs to generosity, patience, forgiveness. All belong to the tend and befriend system, and it has 4 sub-neurological systems under its umbrella. And this I took mostly from a book by Kelly McGonigal called The Upside of Stress. Is anybody familiar with Kelly McGonigal's work on stress? Anyway, highly recommended. And I have a select source slide at the end, and she's on it, and I want to give her credit for this. There's the social caregiving system, which produces the neurotransmitter oxytocin. You've heard of oxytocin. It's got a lot of press as the moral neurotransmitter, which is very simplistic. But oxytocin does create empathy and trust, and it does inhibit the fear centers of the brain, and it does increase hope and courage. So when oxytocin, by the way, and this is one of the many things I've learned from Kelly. Kelly is also involved in the Stanford program, so I got to know her personally. Oxytocin is a stress hormone. Tend and befriend is a stress system. And what I learned from Kelly is that not all stress is bad. There's only one kind of stress that's bad, and it's only bad when it becomes chronic, and that's the flight, fight, freeze response. That can be very, very good for you if you have got to get away from a predator. But the minute you're safe from the predator, you don't want to have this stress response activated at all. Very, very hard on you. So the real problem in our psychology is that when that system gets activated, it can be so powerful, it's very hard for us to control. And that's the reason why when you're working with people who are dealing with profound pain and suffering, that system can easily get triggered. And when that system gets triggered, then you're off the rails. You got to get back on the rails. So oxytocin, hope and courage, more empathy, you want to connect, you're more trusting, you're more forgiving, so on. Now the downside of oxytocin that people don't like to talk about is that it also causes you to be more aggressive towards people in the outgroup. It really gets triggered for when you have interactions with people that you consider to be in your group. And it seems to feed off of the distinction between people that are in your group and people that aren't in your group. Of course, these are arbitrary distinctions, but anyway, they're psychologically real. Then there is a reward system. So compassion does release dopamine. And dopamine is pleasurable, it primes motivation, it depresses fear, and it also increases optimism, it primes for action, and it's reinforcing. So it's true, when you're feeling compassion for someone who's suffering and you're helping them or you're trying to help them, you will get dopamine released in your brain, and that will feel good, and that helps to explain the so-called helper's high. very, very well known, documented, that you can get uplifted from helping, not just compassion, but that's because of dopamine. That's because you're connecting into the reward system, which is good. You can understand why this is useful, because then it reinforces us in the future to be compassionate. And then there's this, what Kelly calls the attunement system, or it's like kind of the social system, releases serotonin. The mirror neurons are part of this system. And that primes perception, that primes intuition and self-control. It enhances cognition, wise discernment. Wise discernment. So the attunement system is, so when your compassion is activated in the form that I described earlier, you have all of these systems working in your brain. If you cultivate compassion, you'll notice an increase in your intuitive accuracy. Intuition is a very, very important form of knowing emotional states in others. And the more you cultivate compassion, you are refining your empathic processes. It's a way of refining them and enhancing them and cultivating them and improving them. And that directly leads to an increase in intuitive accuracy. And then the last thing is you're engaging the prefrontal cortex, because you're going to be thinking about, you have a distinction between the self and other. You have a problem of what can I do? Is there anything I can do? What would be the most effective thing to do? The thing in compassion that people, you have to, people acting from compassion, you realize that sometimes the best thing to do is not to do anything. And the suffering just needs to be allowed to pass its natural course. And don't try to stop it. Just let it happen. Other times maybe you want to stop it. It's very circumstance by circumstance. So sometimes, you may think, oh, I'm not going to do anything. And the suffering, it's just, I think this is just part of the growing process. And I want you to grow. And if I were to stop the pain somehow, you'd stop learning the new skill. Right? Learning new skills, developing our capacity is always going to produce some pain, because we're moving beyond our comfort levels every single time, right? So there's going to be something going on there that's distressing, right? Sometimes, that's just part of the process. You can try to comfort in that way, but not try to diminish it, right? So that's also, so you need to be really thinking clearly, reasoning, and all of this, when it gets engaged, inhibits impulsiveness, inhibits fear. So all these four systems reinforce each other. They're all mutually reinforcing in the moment and in the future. And I'm just going to throw this out to you, and you can disagree with me. This is what I'm writing about in my book. Cultivating pro-social dispositions like compassion is, in my opinion, the most important ingredient to living a good life. It's more important than anything else. And the biological source for courage, optimism, patience, and meaning. So if you want to have meaning in your life, you want to have purpose in your life, you want to have courage in your life, you want to have hope and optimism, you want to be patient, become more compassionate. And this is why I argue that compassion is intrinsically uplifting, energizing, and an inexhaustible source of meaning and purpose. And you can never go wrong with compassion. It's one of the few things that I think that you can count on will always steer you in the right direction. So you cannot care too much. Do you guys know this mindset theory from Carol Dweick? I always get it wrong. So the basic idea, I'm just throwing it in here because I just think the growth mindset is connected to the tendon preference system and compassion, which is why it's so uplifting. She identifies the growth mindset is a deep-seated belief that our capacities are subject to improvement over time, that failure is an opportunity to learn, that change is okay and desirable, and that painful states come and go just as pleasurable ones do. It's a growth mindset. It's called a growth mindset. versus the fixed mindset, which is my intelligence is fixed, my capacities are fixed, there's nothing I can do to improve them, and how do I know what they are? By my performance. So I tend to freak out and get very nervous and anxious about my performance because it's going to show whether I'm adequate or inadequate, and so it creates a lot of insecurity and suffering. The growth mindset is a healthy, sustainable, long-term mindset to hold, and I think the growth mindset is a natural expression of our pro-social neurobiology. I think we're naturally optimistic, naturally courageous. There's a problem, okay, but we can solve it. There's always problems. We can solve the problem. There's a problem. Yeah, things are really tough right now in the United States. Yeah, okay. All right, well, that's the reality, right? So did you see the movie? I can't remember the movie with Tom Hanks and this guy, that good Bridge of Spies. Did you see Bridge of Spies? And he's defending an East German defector, and the East German defector is implacable, and he's going to get executed. And he goes, and Tom says to him, why aren't you upset more? And the guy said, well, would worrying about it make a difference? And he said, no. He says, well, then what's the point of worrying about it? And it reminds me of another expression from this Indian teacher who said, if there's something that you can do about it, then why worry? And if there's nothing you can do about it, then why worry? Why worry, right? So we worry because we think we're going to fail, right? So the growth mindset is really useful for controlling anxiety, worrying, activating ego insecurities.